Now live. Maybe. Yeah, it's live. Hello. Oh, hi, Eduardo. Hello, everyone. Probably not what you were expecting. We are not. We are live streaming a protest right now at City Hall. Pete Friedman, our founder, is there. You guys have probably become pretty familiar with him. So to watch the stream of the protest, you can go to youtube.com/centraltrack, twitch.tv/centraltrack, twitter.com/central_track, and facebook.com/centraltracker to watch a stream of the protest, one of the protests in Dallas right now. I will be joined by Miguel Solis, trustee of Dallas ISD School Board, as well as the executive director of the Coalition for New Dallas. So that's what's happening here. So if you came here for a live stream of a protest, I'm sorry. But you can find them at all of the places I just listed. So, and I think Miguel is here. Maybe. How's it going, man?
It's going well, Alec. How are you?
Good. Thanks for taking the time to join me for this.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Happy to. It's my first Instagram live. So
Really?
You've popped my Instagram live.
I think every single person I've talked to so far on this has said that exact same thing. I had never done Instagram live before we started doing these either, so
I'm still like, ever since like the lockdown and stuff. I've been watching all the DJ sets, across the nation.
Yeah.
And the battle series. So that's been great. Yeah. I watched the RZA and who did he go against? It was the RZA and dang, I'm forgetting. Oh, the DJ Premier. Anyway.
Oh, okay.
So that got me hooked on.
Yeah. Stuff. No, I watched the Nelly and I think it was Ludacris one. That was a good one.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for joining me. I kind of just want to talk to you about everything that's going on right now because there's a lot to talk about. And there's like layers to it all too. So first, as I just said, Miguel you're on the board of trustees for Dallas ISD. And you are also the executive director of the Coalition for New Dallas.
Yeah. Right.
Talk to me a little bit about what the Coalition for New Dallas does, if you summarize it as best you can, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the short of it is that we're an urban policy think tank that was established back in 2015 with the focus on trying to, end the systemic barriers that have been put in place in the city, particularly as it relates to city planning, so that people from all walks of life in the city have access to equal opportunity. And so, like, very specifically, that means trying to think about different ways that we think of housing policy or transportation policy, education policy, and so on and so forth. So that's basically what we do in a nutshell. And it dovetails real well with the work that I've been doing on the school board for now the past 7 years.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, and I we'll talk about that more in a minute, but I think a lot of people don't realize that oppression and segregation and those, it's deeper than just our police system. It is very much, intertwined with transportation and public schooling, which you obviously have a lot of experience with. So leading into that, talk to me a little bit about the column you had published in the Dallas Morning News.
Yeah.
You mentioned documented and clear, understood fact of segregation and racism in Dallas's history. And we know that this is a nationwide problem. But you spoke specifically about the history of it in Dallas. So talk to me a little bit more about what you detailed in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me first start by saying the reason why I wrote that op-ed is because I'm just there's a little bit of me that's frustrated with specifically the way that policymakers are approaching this, knowing that we've had for forever to do something about this. And, you see all these righteous social media posts about, we stand in solidarity and Black Lives Matter, and we're going to do work on this stuff. But like, this isn't the first time that a Black man has been murdered in the streets by a police officer, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also not the first time that we specifically could have done something about this. So that the spirit of the op-ed came in a bit of frustration. And I guess that may not be the best state of mind to be writing an op-ed for the Dallas Morning News, but I felt like I needed to say something as a policymaker who actually has a power to do something about it.
Mm.
And to own the fact that, like, even though I feel like I've done a lot of things, there's still a hell of a lot that I need to do. So that was number one. The second thing is to say, we have to move past these proclamations of wanting to do better and put specific policies in place. But before you do that, there is a bit of recognition that has to happen about the structural racism and oppression that has happened in this city.
Mm-hmm.
And without clear recognition of that and stating that recognition, it's really hard to move forward from a policy standpoint. But then the last thing is a call for reparation. And like, when you drop a word like reparation, that straight up, I mean, that starts a whirlwind of conversation because of the historical notion of reparation and the politics that comes around that word. But I'm being very specific with a form of reparation that we can actually institute in our community. So that's the reason why I wanted to write the op-ed. But there are very specific things that happen in this city that, if we don't explicitly say happen, we will never be able to re-engineer the city to work for every single person. So I'm happy to talk about those specific things.
Yeah, please do.
So yeah, I mean, I think we start with the fact that this country was founded in very much a racist way. I mean, it was certainly a path to, people's freedom from Europe and other places. Mm-hmm. But almost immediately the slave trade started. And so from essentially the inception, we oppressed Black people, right? So you start there and you talk about the history of slavery, but then to take it into, these modern times, I think there's some people that still believe that when slavery ended, things automatically got significantly better, and they've been better ever since.
Yeah.
Like, that sounds like a laughable statement, but like, I can't tell you how many people I've had conversations with in my life that say to me, people have freedom now, right? And so everything, it's on you to do better. But LBJ said in a speech back in '64 to Howard University, he said, freedom is not enough. You can't expect people to gain freedom and then just assume everybody's on an equal playing field. The other thing you need to know about after slavery was, like, immediately oppression happened in a different way. It was the Black Codes, which were actual rules, laws, and policies that were put in place to disenfranchise, freed African Americans. And then after the Black Codes, you had Jim Crow. And after Jim Crow, you had, things like racial exclusionary zoning. We had that in Dallas. The city council passed it in 1917, which said if you are Black or brown or Jewish or a few other minorities at the time, you cannot live in these certain parts of Dallas. That was found unconstitutional in the early 1920s. And yet we still tried to do it until we were told explicitly, if that is unconstitutional, you can't do it. And so after that was eliminated, we had race restrictive covenants that were housing deeds that essentially said you cannot sell this home to a Black or a brown person. You can find that you can still find these covenants in places like Swiss Avenue. If you pull the deeds on those homes, you can see it explicitly says you can't sell this home to a Negro. You can't sell this home to a Mexican. After you had things like block busting, which is essentially a real estate practice to try to go into communities as a real estate agent and to get white people to sell their homes for cheap, because you would say Black people were moving into your community, and then they would sell those homes to minorities, specifically Black and Mexicans, and would create contracts with them that they couldn't fulfill. So then they would evict these people, take over their homes, and do the same thing to the next African American or Hispanic. And then after race block busting, we had things like federal redlining. There's a map that you can go find that the federal government created through the Homeowners Loan Corporation that essentially color-coded all of Dallas at the time. And if you were coded blue or yellow, you were able to get access to the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which would give you loans to be able to get a home. This was a New Deal project that happened in the 30s. But if you were coded yellow or red, you essentially had no access to these loans. And if you didn't have access to loans, you couldn't get the house. If you couldn't get the house, then you couldn't build equity. And if you couldn't build equity, you could never get into the middle class. You can still find the Dallas Federal Red Line map. I've posted it on my Twitter hundreds of, probably thousands of times at this point. After, so federal redlining. And then where we place highways. We straight up put highways in Black and brown communities in Dallas, in Stringtown, in Short North Dallas, in Deep Ellum. By the way, did you know how did Deep Ellum get its name? Are you familiar with that?
I know it was like pretty much founded by Black and brown people, correct?
It was a historic Black community.
That's what I
thought.
Name of
Deep Ellum, the way that people pronounced Elm Street was Ellum. So they called it the Deep Ellum community.
I did not know that.
So there's these beautiful communities that right now don't exist because we placed 345, Interstate 345, and North Central Expressway in these communities. School segregation. Dallas ISD in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education came out, and there was a palliative statement that Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren put in place. And it was that segregation you can't have. And so local institutions need to take action to ensure that you're not segregated, but do it with all deliberate speed, which essentially meant take your time. The Dallas Independent School District did not come out of the federal desegregation court order until 2003.
Wow.
And still to this day, we're a segregated public school system. So, Alec, I could go on for forever because that's just a smidge of what's actually happened. But I say it to simply say we have a shit ton more work to do, especially policymakers who are in a position like myself, and those in city leadership right now. So anyway.
So do you feel like then that city council and the mayor have ignored a lot of that?
I think for generations they've ignored a lot of that. But let me also be completely honest. So is the Dallas School Board. So have the Dallas County Commissioners. Not everybody has necessarily ignored it, in that there have been a lot of people, myself included, who have said we need to do stuff to re-engineer the centuries plus worth of policy engineering that structured a hyper-segregated city like Dallas. There have been few people that have put forth policies to try to do that. I feel like I've done that to a degree. I think I saw a comment earlier by someone who's watching you. What are some things that have actually happened? So like in Dallas ISD, back in 2014, I became the president of the school board. And I created something called the Racial Equity Commission, which was an attempt to try to understand, what is leading to the fact that, like, specifically Black children are significantly behind in things like reading or mathematics or science. And so we began studying the idea and thinking about how we might create a policy around racial equity, which is essentially doing more for specific groups of people. That eventually led to our administration and trustees working on equity issues. I then created a policy to stop the practice of out-of-school suspension, because Black boys were specifically being disproportionately impacted by out-of-school suspension. We were straight up kicking out 5, 6, 7-year-olds from suspending them, sending them home, telling them do better and become a different human being in 3 days, child, and then come back and don't get in trouble. which was like an ass backwards approach. But it took me a year to pass a policy to ban out of school suspension for our most vulnerable children. And I was only able to get it done from pre-K through third grade.
Mm.
The worst area that this is happening, though, is in middle school. Our 6th, 7th, and 8th grade kids there's this massive spike in out of school suspension. So there's more to be done. The Dallas ISD also created a racial equity resolution, which I co-authored with my colleague Joyce Foreman, which is basically calling out our racist past. And then we created a racial equity policy. And the latest thing that I've been working on is creating a bond package of $41 million that will take those federal red line maps and allow us to have targeted reparation in 4 strategic communities: the Lincoln community, Lincoln Madison, Pinkston, Roosevelt, and Spruce, which are communities that historically have not had the resources necessary to have the same opportunity as other people. So that's a host of things, but policymakers, we got to be thinking big like that. And we have to recognize the history that put these policies in place as well.
So someone asked in the comments, are there any specific policymakers that you've worked with that you feel are actively trying to work towards these goals?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the Dallas ISD context right now. We've got a super majority in fact, I'd say we have a unanimous group of board members who want to continue to figure out what more we can do from a racial equity standpoint. Our president, Justin Henry, has been a great colleague of mine. We actually just passed on Friday, a Black Lives Matters resolution, which essentially said for the next 30 days, we're going to study bold concepts that we can bring back to the administration to potentially change certain systems. But Justin was the person that really wrote that and led the effort. So he's been a great ally, as have the other trustees. You know, at City Hall, I think that you see Adam Basildua, who's been stepping up, being a strong voice for some change. You know, a good colleague of mine, a good friend, Adam Adrano, has been great on that as well. And Omar Narvaez has been doing some really good stuff over in West Dallas to try to reckon with some systemic disparities as well. Chad West, you know, I've had conversations with him about ways that we could coordinate our bonds to more strategically plan, you know, to go deep into some of these communities that have been historically disadvantaged. So there is a contingent of the council that can certainly think big, and I think is going to be willing to take some transformative action.
Did you catch the meeting the other night on Friday by chance?
I spoke at it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was the fifth speaker.
Oh, wow. What were your thoughts on everything?
Let me say this. I will make the argument that today the Dallas School Board has the highest functioning, most like civil public body in Dallas County. I'd put our board up against anybody. I've watched the county commissioners board meetings recently. I watched the city council meetings, and it is bad. I thought it was first 200 some odd speakers. There is certainly people hungry for change, right?
Sure.
And what they had to say was very explicit. It shouldn't be mystifying to city leaders as to what change people want. When people say defund the police or dismantle the police, they have specific things that they're talking about.
Right.
It's not the idea of getting rid of the entire police department and never having policing again. That's not what they're saying. They're saying you need to figure out how to better utilize your resources, and that easily could be moving budget from the police department to other things like housing, actual comprehensive housing policy that gives people access to affordable housing and housing in high opportunity, high wealth, high resourced communities. There are specific things that they want, and they said that. So anybody that says today that they're not sure what the protesters want, that's just bullshit.
Yeah,
we know what they want.
Yeah, I was confused by Mayor Eric Johnson on CNN today saying that he didn't know what um, defunding the police department meant, because everybody made it pretty clear in that the constituents anyway who called in made it pretty clear what they meant by that. So I was kind of I found that puzzling that he said he didn't really understand what that meant. And you're right. A lot of people, I think, or at least some people, maybe are a little hesitant to talk about that because it does sound like on the surface completely getting rid of police officers.
If I were, I don't know who I am to even advise something like this, but were I advising the organizers around, the terminology, like defunding the police immediately it creates a visceral reaction, even from those who want to be allies.
Sure.
But here I am saying that, and then I'm putting a word like reparation in an op-ed, which also has that, like, sometimes you have to use, radicals, maybe too strong a word, but you have to use strong words to get people thinking, to shift their mindset around a new paradigm of thinking things. So, and you know what, like, we're getting the same calls in DISD today. The Texas Organizing Project, Texas Appleseed, Children's Defense Fund, Texas, and others have asked us to dismantle the DISD police department. So, like, we actually have our own police department in DISD, and we've had it for many, many years. And so there are now calls to potentially shift resources from the DISD police department to other things like counselors, social workers. And I think it's a valid request. And I think that'll be one of the things that we consider. I haven't made a decision on it yet, but I'd actually, as people are watching this, what are your thoughts? Type in the comments, like, what are your thoughts on the Dallas ISD having a police department? One, and the second thing would be potentially shifting resources from that to other things like social workers or, counselors. I'd be interested in hearing people's thoughts.
Yeah, you guys can use, I think there should be a question box at the bottom too. Pete did it the other night and it wasn't there, but please feel free to use that too. Okay, so let's talk about, to me, when I first sat down and was really reading about defunding police, honest to God, the first thing that came to my mind was, yeah, that's the first place that they should look to reallocate those funds is public education. So I'm curious to know where you think, beyond things like the obvious, like funds for counselors and social workers. I know that's been tossed around a lot on a national scale. What are other areas of Dallas public education that you think are lacking the necessary funding to be what they could be?
Yeah. So, and I would make the argument that, like, well, I like the way you put it. Maybe lacking the specific funding. So, like, well, here's one thing, right? You think about, like, the notion of white supremacy, which is something that has been thrown around quite a bit over the past few years. Specifically, as the anti-racist approach has continued to grow and gain some traction. I was a history teacher. I was an 8th grade social studies teacher in DISD, well before I became a school board member. And I remember I taught for the last 6 weeks of your social studies curriculum. You basically get to teach whatever you want to teach. And so I taught about the civil rights movement, and I taught specifically about the farm workers movement, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, because I had predominantly Hispanic group of students. But when you look at the U.S. history book and the curriculum in DISD, which is used for most of the state of Texas, if you're a Hispanic or an African American child, you're usually only hearing about the fact that your people were once slaves, or immigrants who have yet to assimilate. Like, that's basically it. And what does that do to the psyche of a child who is in 8th grade, like, super malleable, like just getting into the stage of, like, puberty and like understanding who you are, and it can be devastating. So one thing that we are thinking about doing, we created the first African American history course in Dallas ISD, which now has become statewide curriculum that just recently happened by the State Board of Education. We still think of that, though, as something that kids should opt into. I think that's something that we should mandate in our curriculum, that every single child in all of Dallas ISD have to take African American studies before they graduate. You know, some may think that that's too bold a move. I think it makes, basic sense. Why are we not explaining to other children, specifically children who aren't African American, beauty and the history of the African American experience? It is America's experience. You can't separate the two. So let's make it a mandatory course. That's one thing. Now, that would cost resources. Where are you going to pull those resources from? Maybe you pull it from places like our police department. Another thing that we could do, schools don't have to just be Monday to Friday, 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. For 9 months of the year. Is there a way to retrofit our campuses to include additional services like food? We have schools right now that sit in food deserts. Kids literally only go to the gas station, right, or the convenience store to get their food. And so that's why you see the concentration of health disparities in these areas of concentrated poverty, which, Alec, go back to things like the federal redlining maps. Why don't we have things like health clinics in more of our schools so that kids, people from the community, including parents, can go use that health clinic instead of having to jump on a late bus, which leads to a late train, which leads to Parkland. People aren't doing that right now because they don't like, the transportation system isn't working for them. We could put money into retrofitting campuses. And that's what we're going to begin to do in this bond, if it passes, by creating the Community Resource Index and these school community hubs that are focused on restitution. So that's something we could do in DISD. But then, let's talk about the city. One thing we're focused on the Coalition for a New Dallas, and shout out to Coalition. You should check out our Instagram and our Twitter at Coalition New Dal. We're trying to take down I-345. And for forever, people have said, well, where would the traffic go? Or, well, the Coalition for New Dallas is just some wealthy consortium that is it's a big land grab. Couldn't be further from the truth. That highway went up for racist reasons. Yes, they wanted to have the interstate highway system, but they didn't have to choose those communities. They did it because it was easy and people were disenfranchised. So there are ways to take that down and reimagine that community with a notion of doing more for communities that have been disadvantaged because of public policy. So there's all sorts of things that we can do.
Yeah, I think there's like we've talked about, this is there's a lot of layers to this too, and we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because who knows what's actually going to happen, and we can be hopeful that when I saw the breakdown of money allocated to the police department being $500 million, that blew my mind. But I think there's a lot of room for improvement, but I really do think public education should be a priority when that time comes. And it's interesting to hear probably from no one better than yourself, to paint the picture for that.
There's one other thing too, Alec, that I should mention, just because it's another thing that if we don't have an effective approach to this, then we're going to keep operating on our buckets. And that's this silo system, right? So traditionally, Dallas ISD does its thing. City Council does its thing. Commissioners do their thing. And we all just keep plodding along in our own righteous way, thinking we're doing great when we're not talking to each other to have a systemic approach to the issues, right? So, and then what we rely on, I just noticed a comment from someone talking about what are some nonprofit organizations that we could potentially, put funds to. Like, I run a nonprofit organization. I ran one previously as well. And nonprofits do great work. But there's a difference between, Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to talk about this idea of policy liberalism versus programmatic liberalism. Policy liberalism was stuff that was done in the new era, where you had you created something like Social Security, right? Or the GI Bill. Massive policy changes that completely changed the way that people lived, acted, interacted with each other. And then there's program liberalism. A lot of that happened in the 60s with the Great Society. And it created things like nonprofit organizations. The problem with program liberalism is you have all of these individual nonprofits that are trying to do great work and are really doing good things, but they're not incentivized to work with each other because they're all competing for the same dollars. And if you're helping other people out, you may not be getting your money necessary to keep your nonprofit organization going. So yes, I think that we need to continue to work with nonprofit organizations, but we have to have a policy structure that's in place. And the way to best do it is to have government organizations working together. Government won't solve the problem, but they can create the policy foundation necessary to actually be able to support people's advancement towards opportunity.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on all of that. We have a question here from someone. Let me see. What are your thoughts on charter schools in Dallas?
Yep. Yeah, teach it, uplift, and Deep Ellum. Yeah, so the first thing I'll say about charter schools is I always love to go back to how charter schools were created, because I think it's really important for people to recognize where they came from and what they were ultimately intended on being used for. The concept of a charter school came from a guy you would never expect, Albert Schenker, who was the person that you think about when you think of the power of unions. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think he either led the AFT or was one of the leaders of the large union movement that coordinated with the American Federation of Teachers. The reason charter schools are set up was to allow for innovation, to essentially allow for educators to leave their traditional public school districts and innovate, removing themselves from the regulations and rules that hampered their innovation in public schools, and take those ideas and then infuse those ideas back into traditional public education. That was their original intention. What happened is that they became their own organization. And that organization, in many ways, created a financial incentive to grow the organization, the charter management organizations. So essentially what charter schools have become is sort of a way to innovate, but sort of, it's created dissonance between traditional public schools. And, the notion of funding obviously comes up. When a public school system loses a child to some other place, that means that they're going to lose funding based on the way that the education funding system is set up. I would make the argument, I don't think public schools deserve any child. Like, we shouldn't have a monopoly on kids. We should be able to create good choice in our public school system that compete with charter schools so that we ultimately, retain our kids. And the last thing I would say is that charter schools in Dallas have forced us in DISD to get better. It's the reason why we have our choice system now. And the other thing that we've done that I would make the argument, and, not trying to bash on charter schools, but like when you look at charter schools, they are as segregated, if not more segregated, than Dallas public schools. And so what we're trying to do is create something called mixed socioeconomic integration schools, where we are literally desegregating DISD by creating schools where 50% of the kids have to get in by having low income status, and the other 50% have to be middle to upper income status. And these schools are growing in popularity, and we're seeing the middle class, specifically middle class white people, come back to DISD. We have a long way to go on this, but it's a path towards desegregating our public schools. And some of that, it happens because charter schools forced us to think innovative and get better quickly.
Okay. We have another one. The Office of Cultural Affairs wrote a 10-year cultural plan in which money was going to be distributed as grants, so artists could connect with neglected. I can't even read Instagram won't let me read the whole thing.
Yeah. So what I can say is when I was running for mayor, the Office of Cultural Affairs was a hot topic, and specifically the topic was around: is there a way to shift funds over to the Office of Cultural Affairs that traditionally went other places? Specifically, went to things like Visit Dallas and the convention industry. Um, there's a lot of good argument to be made that shifting those monies to the Office of Cultural Affairs would specifically improve access to the arts from by disadvantaged communities that historically haven't had it, or just like they're not going to be in the arts district for whatever reason. I think it's a smart move. I think the problem with big plans, and the people that advocated for the cultural affairs plan will say this themselves, is that oftentimes plans get placed on a bookshelf. So this is another area for city leadership, I think, to potentially have, an opportunity to lead on would be thinking about how you might shift certain funds over to make that plan more robust and actually have it implemented.
So one thing I want to circle back to, you mentioned reparations briefly earlier. Can you talk to me more about specific what that, and like you said, that term can kind of create, a conversation. Can you tell me specifically what you mean?
Yeah. So when you hear the term reparation, I think the first thing that people think about is 40 acres and a mule, which was an order issued by William Tecumseh Sherman, who had essentially become the number 2 to Ulysses S. Grant once Ulysses S. Grant took over the Army during the Civil War. During Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea, his Atlanta campaign, he issued essentially a directive to allow for freed slaves that had been freed due to the Emancipation Proclamation to receive 40 acres and a mule to till the land on that acreage, as a way to try to pay them back for the justice that had been, justice, the liberty and freedoms that had been robbed from them, in their lifetime and in generations' lifetimes prior to that. So when people think about reparations, that's what initially they think about. And there has been a movement in Congress for years to both study reparations and also potentially figure out ways to fund African Americans who have lineage that date all the way back to slavery. What I'm talking about when I use the term reparation is getting much more closer to our time that we live in, this past century, and doing a historical analysis first of the specific policies that our city put in place, specifically the Dallas School Board, the City Council, that would have led to the segregation that we see in Dallas today. And then once we have that analyzed, using, again, things like these race-based covenants, the policies that were passed, like the racial exclusionary zoning and the federal red line map, now you have a much more clear set of documents and areas in our community that we could potentially do more for through each of our government entities. That could look like the next time that the Dallas City Council goes after a bond, not equally spreading the bond across all 14 council districts. That's how the council creates their bonds. They say every single council district is going to get the exact same money for the exact same projects. Well, if you do that, that's not equity. That's right. Not restitution. It's saying, what are the communities that have had the worst time due to race and racism and quite honestly, white supremacy? And can we give them more of the bond? Mm-hmm. Now, what would more of the bond look like? It might mean more money allocated to affordable housing construction. It might mean more money allocated to things like broadband connectivity, literally paying for people to have free broadband connectivity so they have access to the internet. It could mean creating things like health clinics with Parkland, with DISD. Those are just a few examples. But when I use the term reparation or restitution or equity, that's what I mean. We know these communities and we know they deserve more because we know ultimately we did this to them. We're the ones that put this in place.
So, someone in the comments mentioned, and I'm curious to know what you think about this, or if this is even a thing in DIC. I've lived all over Texas. I'm originally from Austin, but I went to middle school in Houston,
Where'd you
and
go?
I went to Lanier Middle
Linear.
School,
Yeah.
inner city, and there's a system, they call them clusters. So cluster A, cluster B, cluster C. Cluster A was AP classes, cluster B was IB classes, and then cluster C was just the regular, I guess, base curriculum.
Yep.
And it was very evident, not just, I mean, anybody could have walked into that school and noticed, but we even knew it as 10, 11, 12-year-old kids.
Yep.
All of the kids, most of the kids, 99% of them in cluster A were white. Then you got down to cluster B. There was maybe a little bit more, a few more black and brown people, but I was in cluster C, but I think I was in like one cluster B class for English, whatever. And but but in my cluster it was predominantly black and brown students, and it couldn't have been more clear even to us.
Yeah.
So does DISD have a system like that?
We do.
And
we do.
So do you think that that's
It needs to change.
Okay.
Change. We have disparities in our magnet schools. We have disparities in our AP classes. We have disparities in our IB programs, our international baccalaureate programs. We have major disparities. I'll go back. We have disparities in school discipline. We have disparities in African American reading comprehension. One of the reasons why, I and some of my colleagues pushed so hard for so many years to create a racial equity department and a racial equity policy was for this very reason. We knew these data existed, but there wasn't anybody in the administration that was solely focused on rooting out these inequities and then moving forward with like specific policies that would have to change. So that is the reason that we created it, was to get to the root cause of what you're talking about. Now, we have a long way to go. Our racial equity department, is beginning to do this, and I think could be improved in specific areas. And I've made that known verbally many times at our school board meetings. And it'll be one of the things that I talk about in these next 30 days when each trustee comes up with their thoughts on what could potentially change as it relates to our Black Lives Matter resolution that charged us to do it. But we got to do it. And look, it brings me back to the reason why I wrote this op-ed, right? I started off, I'm looking at it right now. I said, Dallas policymakers have failed to combat the virus currently plaguing our community. To be clear, I'm talking about racism. If we don't say that explicit as policymakers currently, if we do not say we have failed, then we're telling ourselves a lie, and everything we say after that is an attempt to try to, cover up for the failure. Let's talk about what we failed at and then how we can improve it. And the other thing, people want to know, when are these protests going to stop? They're not going to stop. They may die down for a little bit, but they're not going to stop. And the Greeks had a word for this. It was called thumos. It's spelled T-H-Y-M-O-S. Plato came up with it. Thumos is not desire, your desire for things. Thumos is not reason, like necessarily, logically thinking through things. Thumos is right at the core. It's in the soul. It's this innate human capacity for justice and for self-worth, to know how to value yourself and to know when people aren't valuing what you and how you value yourself. The reason why people are out protesting, it's not just because God rest his soul, George Floyd passed away. Because guess what? Ahmaud Arbery passed away, right? Trayvon Martin passed away. Botham Jean passed away. Breonna Taylor passed away. And I'm using the word passed away. They were murdered. This isn't the first time people have risen up in the streets. It's more than just that. It's systemic oppression. It's the fact that governments haven't done what they've needed to do to improve this. And it's also the fact that people will not acknowledge this history, or they don't even know it. And so people are going to continue to be in the streets.
Someone brought up a good point, and I want to touch on this because I know you brought it up in your column. A lot of our low-income families had a hard time with online learning due to internet connections. How are we going to close the gap for the upcoming school year due to COVID-19 restrictions?
So a couple of things again, and I'm proud of the stuff that we are doing in DISD, specifically in this area. One of the things that we had done prior to COVID was we made sure that most of our kids have had access to laptops, to Google Chromebooks. Additionally, we had begun the process of purchasing the hotspots, the mobile hotspots. So when it came time to, give kids access to this technology, we had a lot of it to give to kids almost immediately, but it didn't cover everything. And so what we had to do was the board took a vote to multiple millions of dollars to buy more hotspots and to ensure that we had more Chromebooks. And then we issued those out, and then we raised money through the Dallas Education Foundation to ensure that we had even more money so that kids that needed access to it had it. That said, that's a stopgap solution. Dallas ISD has explicitly said, we believe that every child in Dallas ISD should have access to free broadband connectivity. And so we've created a project called Operation Connectivity that just started two or 3 weeks ago. And we're going to begin piloting free broadband to Dallas ISD kids. And eventually, ideally by January of 2021, we'll have broadband connectivity for every kid in DISD. It's going to cost a little bit of money. It's going to take coordination. We're working with the Council of Great City Schools, which is a national collaborative of large urban school systems, to try to figure out how we can work with them to help us think through this. But that's what we want to do. And again, that is a concept of restitution. The idea of doing more for some who historically were systematically oppressed, and is a very, very good reason of why they don't have this stuff to begin with.
We have another question here. Will DISD move to make LMSW and LCSW schools based like at Uplift and GPISD schools? I don't know what you probably know what that means better than I do.
I actually don't. I don't know what those letters stand for. If whoever typed that, if I don't know if they're still on, but if somebody knows it, if you could type it in the comment section.
Yeah,
maybe
please elaborate. I did want to ask you about, as far as I know, you haven't been able to attend any of the protests in person, right? Because you have an immunocompromised daughter, right?
Yeah, so I love attending protests. The last time, let me go back to the license. Okay, license. Yeah,
go ahead.
Social workers. Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. I apologize that I didn't know that was a terminology. So there are not necessarily specific plans just yet to figure out how to have more licensed master social workers in DISD. And we have some. And in fact, licensed social workers were allocated, more licensed social workers were allocated as a part of our Accelerating Campus Excellence program, the ACE program, which a lot of people talk about and has been huge in helping improve academic achievement for communities that were historically under perpetual underperformance from an academic achievement standpoint. So we placed more social workers in those schools, and it had a great effect. But to get more social workers, we need more money. So that brings us back to this idea of, well, where do you pull money from? Do you potentially pull money from, pet projects? Do you pull money from the internal police department? Do you pull it from, the school resource officer program? That's going to be a discussion that we have over the next 30 days. And so you'll need to keep, tuning in to DISD school board meetings to hear about what we're thinking about. But, as I'm hearing this, that'll be one of the things that I'm happy to discuss. But one other thing, like, and then I'll get to the protest question that you had.
Sure.
One thing that I'd love to see people's comments on is, I'm trying to be as vulnerable as I can possibly be, because I think that's another thing that policymakers need to do. Like, step away from like this like mask of you have to have the perfect answer every time.
Yeah.
Like, be open to hearing people's thoughts and just like exposing your vulnerability. So like, when I hear of completely dismantling, you know, the school resource officer program and the police department, I think back to like a year ago, whenever people were telling us we need to have more police, we need to have more school resource officers, because our schools are getting shot up. And that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
They're like, that school shootings are rampant. So help me better understand the balance there. Like, type in the comments and, you know, send it to me on Twitter at Solis for Dallas. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But on the protest standpoint, I love protests. I try to go to them as much as I can. One of my favorite was the protest that we did, basically in commemoration of the major protests that happened around the DREAM Act. That was a huge protest that happened many, many years ago in Dallas. And so there was another one related to DACA after Trump, you know, put out his horrible policies for sending DACA and so on and so forth. You know, I like to go to protests. Unfortunately, right now, I can't do it as much. In fact, my wife won't let me do it at all. And happy wife, happy life, because my daughter had a heart transplant, and she's now she's over 2 years old, but she takes medicines that have her immunocompromised significantly. And so, you know, when you think about something like COVID, she's the type of kid that is the most susceptible to basically perishing from something like COVID because of her immune system. So I can't do it, but I follow it as much as I can. And that's another reason to a degree why I decided to write that op-ed, because I wanted people to know at least one policymaker is hearing what people are saying, and wants to convey to them my thoughts on ways that we might be able to move forward.
Yeah, that's something I've seen a lot of, at least just on social media, is people are definitely taking note of policymakers, the absence of policymakers at these protests, because I mean, at the end of the day, you guys are the ones who can change this.
So yo, you got to keep streaming Central Live, lives, so that way.
No, thank you. Yeah, please. I don't know if Pete's still going, but for those of you who are watching, you probably joined this expecting streams of the protests. We're not doing Instagram anymore. We're only doing YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and Facebook. It's youtube.com/centraltrack, twitch.tv/centraltrack, twitter.com/central_track, and facebook.com/centraltracker. But otherwise, I mean, thanks for joining me, Miguel. I have one more question, and this is probably such a ridiculous question, but you ran for mayor in 2019. Do you have plans beyond Dallas ISD again, or is your plate full?
No, I mean, so a couple things. Technically, I'm not even supposed to be a Dallas school board member anymore. I made the announcement that I wasn't going to be running because I've been a school board member for almost 7 years. Mm-hmm. So my term was supposed to end at the beginning of May, but then COVID happened and the governor essentially canceled elections. So I actually have to serve until November.
Oh, okay.
So, but it's great because it also now gives me the opportunity to have a few more months to engage on policy discussions about the stuff that we're talking about. As far as like a future political career is concerned, I never really got into politics with a specific, like, I want to do this school board, mm-hmm. this, and then this, and then this, and then, you know, I'll be the president of the United States. That wasn't for me. Like, if there's a place to not start a political career, it's the Dallas School Board. I mean, it's filled with all sorts of politics and issues, and you're dealing with people's kids. So the reason I ran for mayor was because I recognize that there's only so much that we can do in DISD to get to the intractable problems. And so I ran on this platform of something called the infrastructure of opportunity. So we always talk about the infrastructure of things. But when I think about this notion of restitution, we have to build an infrastructure of opportunity, better housing, continued improvement in education, better transportation, community police relations, and other things. And you can do that on the city council. You can do that as the mayor. That's why I ran for mayor, and I didn't win. So I don't really have an idea about what the next thing could potentially be. But one of the biggest things I need to focus on is, my family and my daughter, because
Sure.
I hate to be dark about it, but I've kind of learned to just recognize the reality situation. I don't know how long I'm going to have my daughter. And so, that's going to be a big priority, spending as much time as I can with her. But I don't know. We'll see. Tell me in the comments, peeps. Let me know what you're
All right, Miguel. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you speaking out. I'm sure everyone does. So thank you, and we'll be in touch soon. We'll have to get you to write a column like that for Central Track soon.
Let me know, man. I'm happy
All right,
to
man.
do it. Take
Thank
it easy.
you.
Yeah, bye.